Good evening, everybody. We are in for a really nice treat tonight. And we're going to hear one of the most, in my view, one of the most gifted poets that we have in the United States. You're probably wondering how to pronounce his last name. And in China, it was Shi. And then his family moved to Shanghai, and it was Se. But in the United States, they've learned to say Z. So I'm glad to introduce you to Arthur Z. I first heard him in Atlanta about a year ago, and he was speaking to a group of academics. Some of us were anthropologists, some of us were political scientists, some of us were literature people, some of us were religious studies like me. You know, we weren't all familiar with poetry, but then he began to read. And he began to read some of his own poetry, and he began to read some of his translations of Chinese poetry. And what struck us was how available and accessible that poetry was to us, and we got a sense for the person behind the reading. So we're so glad to have him here tonight. I looked at his resume in order to prepare this introduction, and I grew very discouraged because it would be impossible to explain to you how much he has done. But I'm going to give it a bit of a try. He was born in New York, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that. I asked him to tell a little bit of his story. He went to MIT for a while. He'll tell a little bit about that. Went to Berkeley and ended up creating one of the first majors in poetry at Berkeley. And that's when he started writing, or when he started publishing. He has 8 books of poetry. The Ginkgo Light, Kipu, The Red-Shifting Web, Archipelago, River River, Dazzled, Two Ravens, The Willow Wind. He has many translations. One is The Silk Dragon, translations from the Chinese. He's recently edited a book, Chinese Writers on Writing. He goes to China. He gets to know young Chinese poets, old Chinese poets. He's interested in cross-cultural collaboration. Arthur Z. Has been Poet Laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He has led many, many, many writing workshops. They range from colleges and universities such as Hendrix College and Yale, Berkeley, to penitentiaries. He's worked with death row inmates. He's interested in communicating poetry to a wide range of people. After he talked in Atlanta that day, that night, a friend of mine came up and he said, you know, I don't think I'd heard a reading like that before. Who is he? And then before I could even say, well, I think you were introduced, Arthur Z., he said, I think he's a bridge builder. I think he bridges cultures, East and West. He's done a lot of work with Native peoples. Maybe he'll tell us some about that tonight. Bridges cultures within the United States. He bridges academics with death row inmates. That's kind of what he's about. So we are very glad to have you with us tonight, Arthur, and we look forward to hearing some of your poetry and you telling a little bit of the story of how it all got started. Welcome with me, Arthur Z.
Thank you, Jay, and I want to thank Hope Coulter. It was such a pleasure to go to Jay's and Hope's classes this morning and meet with some of you in those classes. I also want to thank Henrietta Vanneman and the Hendrix Murphy Foundation for bringing me here. A few years ago, I met a group of Hendrix College students. They came to Santa Fe, and they were going to Indian pueblos and meeting a lot of different artists and writers in New Mexico, and that was my first experience with Hendrix students, and I thought they were all wonderful. So it's really a great privilege to be here this evening. I'm going to read across books and weave in some translations of ancient Chinese poetry, but I also want to leave some time at the end so we can have some discussion. Can you hear me all right in back? It's okay. I'd like to start with this poem. It's called The Shapes of Leaves. Ginkgo, cottonwood, pin oak, sweet gum, tulip tree. Our emotions resemble leaves, and alive to their shapes we are nourished. Have you felt the expanse and contours of grief along the edges of a big Norway maple? Have you winced at the orange flare searing the curves of a curling dogwood? I have seen from the air logged islands, each with a network of branching gravel roads, and felt a moment of pure anger, aspen gold. I have seen sandhill cranes moving in an open field, a single white whooping crane in the flock. And I've traveled along the contours of leaves that have no name. Here, where the air is wet and the light is cool, I feel what others are thinking and do not speak. I know pleasure in the veins of a sugar maple. I am living at the edge of a new leaf. Though it's not stated directly, this next poem is situated in Tokyo, Japan, and it's called In Your Honor. One of my obsessions has to do with what I like to call cultural parallax, the way different cultures view certain situations. In your honor, a man presents a sea bass tied to a black lacquered dish by green spun seaweed. Ah is heard throughout the room. You're unsure what is about to happen. You might look through a telescope at the full bright moon against deep black space. See from the Bay of Dew to the Sea of Nectar. But no, this beauty of naming is a subterfuge. What are the thoughts of hunters driving home on a Sunday afternoon empty-handed? Their conception of honor may coincide with your conception of cruelty. The slant of light as sun declines is a knife separating will and act into infinitely thin and lucid slices. You look at the sea bass's eye, clear and luminous. The gills appear to move ever so slightly. The sea bass smells of dream, but this is no dream. Ah, such delicacy is heard throughout the room, and the sea bass suddenly flaps. It bleeds and flaps as the host slices slice after slice of glistening sashimi. This next poem is in two parts, and I was telling the creative writing class today that I got to a certain stage where I wanted to be able to enlarge or expand a poem. My early poems tend to be very short, and this was one of my early attempts at writing something a little longer. It's in two sections, but you can feel in the voice behind it that it's sort of stretching or pushing the boundaries. It's called The Unnameable River. Is it in the anthracite face of a coal miner, crystallized in the veins and lungs of a steel worker, pulverized in the grimy hands of a railroad engineer? Is it in a child naming a star, coconuts washing ashore, dormant in a volcano along the Rio Grande? You can travel the 4,000 miles of the Nile to its source and never find it. You can climb the 5 highest peaks of the Himalayas and never recognize it. You can gaze through the largest telescope and never see it. But it's in the capillaries of your lungs. It's in the space as you slice open a lemon. It's in a corpse burning on the Ganges, in rain splashing on banana leaves. Perhaps you have to know you are about to die to hunger for it. Perhaps you have to go alone into the jungle armed with a spear to truly see it. Perhaps you have to have pneumonia to sense its crush. But it's also in the scissor hands of a clock. It's in the precessing motion of a top when a torque makes the axis of rotation describe a cone, and the cone spinning on a point gathers past, present, future. In a crude theory of perception, the apple you see is supposed to be a copy of the actual apple. But who can step out of his body to compare the two? Who can step out of his life and feel the Milky Way flow out of his hands? An unpicked apple dies on a branch. That is all we know of it. It turns black and hard, a corpse on the Ganges. Then go ahead and map out 3,000 miles of the Yangtze. Walk each inch. Feel its surge and flow as you feel the surge and flow in your own body. And the spinning cone of a precessing top is a form of existence that gathers and spins death and life into one. It is in the duration of words, but beyond words. River, 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 river. The coal miner may not know he has it. The steel worker may not know he has it. The railroad engineer may not know he has it. But it is there. It is in the smell of an avocado blossom and in the true passion of a kiss. I'm going to move to ancient China. When I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, I did a lot of translations of Tang Dynasty poetry and earlier, and I saw that as a way of learning my craft. I would write out the characters, character by character, stroke by stroke, and it was a way for me to personalize the language and think about how not just the characters were created, but how, as a poet, certain characters were chosen and how they were juxtaposed or placed next to each other to create the kinds of rhythmical and musical and imagistic effects that classic Chinese poetry depends so much on. One of the great early poets is Tao Chen, Tao Yuanming, whose dates are 365 to 427 Common Era. And I always think that's a great testimony to poetry, that you can read something written that long ago and it can still be so fresh today. And Tao Chen was one of the early dropouts in the Chinese tradition. He got up one morning and basically quit his job, and he built his own house, and he grew chrysanthemums and wrote poetry. And he wrote a series of, I'm trying to think, 17 or 19, I think 19 drinking wine poems. And these are two of them that I want to share with you in English translation. Drinking Wine. A green pine is in the east garden, but the many grasses obscure it. A frost wipes out all the other species, and then I see its magnificent tall branches. In a forest, Men do not notice it, but standing alone, it is a miracle. I hang a jug of wine on a cold branch, then stand back and look again and again. My life spins with dreams and illusions. Why then be fastened to the world? Drinking wine. I built my house near where others live, and yet without noise of horse or carriage, you ask, how can this be? A distant mind leaves the earth around it. I pick chrysanthemums below the eastern fence, then gaze at mountains to the south. The mountain air is fine at sunset. Flying birds go back in flocks. In this, there is a truth I wish to tell you, but lose the words. To me, it's amazing that those poems can be so fresh today, so many years later. Jay was mentioning my personal background, which is I grew up in New York City. My father had a long career as a chemical engineer, and he got his PhD at MIT. So I was supposed to follow in his footsteps and become an engineer or scientist. And in high school, I was good at math and science. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I went to MIT, and one day in the first semester, a professor was writing out equations and calculus. And I just looked down and I just started to scribble in my notebook. And pretty soon I scribbled some more, and pretty soon I was writing all of the time, and I sensed that I was writing poetry, and I was really, really excited. Maybe it had been brewing for a long time, but it was coming from deep inside of me, and I felt like this is what I really want to do. I might be good at math and science, but that's really coming from family expectation or whatever, but it wasn't really me. And so that second year at MIT, Denise Levertov, who was a wonderful poet, came and taught a combined MIT-Harvard class, and she had just come east from Berkeley and talked about San Francisco and Berkeley, and so I decided to transfer to Berkeley. And when I went home in my sophomore year, that third semester, and told my parents I was leaving MIT to go to Berkeley and study poetry, they thought I was crazy. They were like, don't ever come back, or like, we can't believe you're doing this. And then when I was at Berkeley, they would call me late at night and say, okay, if you're not going to be a scientist, why not take up law? At least you can work with words. And that didn't work so well. And I was very determined to find my own way as a poet, and created my own major in poetry. I had a professor who basically let me take whatever I wanted. So I took classical Chinese, I took philosophy, I took Blake. I was a kind of a magpie. I had these science credits. But when I graduated from Berkeley, I actually won a small prize for a manuscript of poems, and my first book was published. I was only 21, from a very small press called Rainbow Zenith. And I wanted to go somewhere I'd never been before, so I asked Josephine Miles, the professor I worked with, and she said, oh, try Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's really beautiful, and here are the names of some friends. And I went there and called them, and I didn't have much connection with the first person, but the second writer I called said, oh, we're starting a Poetry in the Schools program. You have a book, why don't you submit your poems and see if you're accepted into the program? And I did, and for the next 10 years I worked all over the state of New Mexico on the Indian reservations, in Spanish-speaking high schools, Los Alamos High School, San Juan, a ranching community in the eastern part of New Mexico near Texas. And during that time, I also started to meet a lot of Native Americans and had a strong affinity with them, and started to do readings at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And in 1983, the president called me and said, we've got an opening, apply, and I did, and they hired me. And 4 years later, I was the director of the creative writing program and built the whole program and oversaw it from a 2-year to a 4-year program. So in a nutshell, that's sort of my background or path. And at an early stage, I wanted to turn my back on science and not use any of that vocabulary or structure. And then I got to the stage where I thought, well, I know that, I should use that, why not? So I'm going to read to you the first sequence I ever wrote. It's in 6 sections, and it's called The Leaves of a Dream or The Leaves of an Onion. And I have this obsession that the world could be like, or the cosmos could be like an apple, and then there are seeds, there are cores or essences. But at the other extreme, maybe the cosmos, the world is like an onion. And if you peel and peel and peel, nothing is left in your hands. So this is the leaves of a dream or the leaves of an onion. Red oak leaves rustle in the wind. Inside a dream, you dream the leaves scattered on dirt and feel it as an instance of the chance configuration to your life. All night you feel red horses galloping in your blood, hear a piercing siren, and are in love with the inexplicable. You walk to your car, find the hazard lights blinking, find a rust-brown knife, a trout, a smashed violin in your hands. And then you wake inside the dream to find tangerines ripening in the silence. You peel the leaves of the dream as you would peel the leaves off an onion. The layers of the dream have no core, no essence. You find a tattoo of a red scorpion on your body. You simply laugh, shiver in the frost, and step back into the world. A Galapagos turtle has nothing to do with the world of the neutrino. The ecology of the Galapagos Islands has nothing to do with a pair of scissors. The cactus by the window has nothing to do with the invention of the wheel. The invention of the telescope has nothing to do with a red jaguar. No. The invention of the scissors has everything to do with the invention of the telescope. A map of the world has everything to do with a cactus by the window. The world of the quark has everything to do with a jaguar circling in the night. The man who sacrifices himself and throws a Molotov cocktail at a tank has everything to do with a sunflower that bends to the light. Open a window and touch the sun, or feel the wet maple leaves flicker in the rain. Watch a blue crab scuttle in clear water, or find a starfish in the dirt. Describe the color green to the color blind, or build a house out of pain. The world is more than you surmise. Take the pines, green-black, slashed by light, etched by wind, on the island across the riptide body of water. Describe the 1,000 iridescent needles to a blind albino tarahumara. In a bubble chamber in a magnetic field, an electron spirals and spirals into the center. But the world is more than such a dance, a spiraling in to the point of origin, a spiraling out in the form of a wet leaf, a blue crab, or a green house. The heat ripples ripple the cactus, crushed green glass in a parking lot, or a pile of rhinoceros bones give off heat, though you might not notice it. The heat of a star can be measured under a spectrometer, but not the heat of the mind, or the heat of Angkor Wat. And the rubble of Angkor Wat gives off heat, So do apricot blossoms in the night, green fish, black bamboo, or a fisherman fishing in the snow. And an angstrom of shift turns the pleasure into pain. The ice that rips the fingerprint off your hand gives off heat. And so does each moment of existence. A red leaf disintegrating in the dirt burns with the heat of an acetylene flame. And the heat rippling off the tin roof of the adobe house is simply the heat you see. What is the secret to a Guarneri violin? Wool dipped in an indigo bath turns bluer when it oxidizes in the air. Marat is changed in the minds of the living. A shot of tequila is related to Antarctica shrinking. A crow in a bar or red snapper on ice is related to the 12-tone method of composition. And what does the tuning of timpani have to do with the smell of your hair? To feel at 30 you have come this far, to see a bell over a door as a bell over a door. To feel the care and precision of this violin is no mistake, nor is the sincerity and shudder of passion by which you live. Crush an apple, crush a possibility. No single method can describe the world. Therein is the pleasure of chaos, of leaps in the mind. A man slumped over a desk in an attorney's office is a parrotfish caught in a seaweed mass. A man who turns to the conversation in a bar is a bluefish hooked on a cigarette. Is the desire and collapse of desire in an unemployed carpenter the instinct of salmon to leap upstream? The smell of eucalyptus can be incorporated into a theory of aggression. The pattern of interference in a hologram replicates the apple, knife, horsetails on the table, but misses the sense of chaos, distorts in its singular view. Then touch, shine, dance, sing, be, becoming, be. The closure to my personal story about becoming a poet is many years later. My father, who's still alive, he's 96 today, but my father had a operation for a small brain tumor, and I went east to see him, and I have two brothers, a cardiologist brother who's older and an investment banker brother who's younger, so I figure my family got two of the three safe professions that they wanted. But it was really interesting and moving to me because at one point my two brothers stepped out of the hospital room, and my father, who just had this operation, turned to me, and this was, many years later when I was becoming pretty well recognized as a poet, and my father turned to me and said, I've never told you this, and your brothers don't know this, but when I was a teenager growing up in China, my dream was to become a poet. And I was just thunderstruck. It was like I had no idea that this was the case, and it was a revelation. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, my father told me I had to become a chemical engineer. The Japanese were occupying northern China. It was you had to go and learn Western science, and the idea was you would learn Western science and bring it back to China. But then there was the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, and so my mother and father stayed in New York City, and in fact all the relatives came out. And so my father never went back to China to use the science that he had learned to contribute in terms of a national cause. So it was a huge revelation to me. I was thunderstruck, and that sort of intimacy of revealing himself. And from that moment on, it was like we saw each other, and it was like complete acceptance for what I had decided to do. But it was a long time coming. So it's interesting to think of family stories and those revelations that can happen. I'm going to come back to ancient China, and here are two poems translated into English during a period of civil strife. Du Fu wrote a poem called Return to Zhang Village, which I really love. There's one word, li, which is a Chinese mile. It's about a third of a Western mile. So this is Du Fu's poem, Return to Zhang Village. Shaggy red clouds in the west. The sun's foot is down to level earth. By the wicker gate, sparrows are chirping. The traveler returns from over 1,000 li. Wife and children panic at my presence. Quieted, they still wipe tears. In this age of turmoil, I floated and meandered, a miracle of chance to return alive. Neighbors crowd the fence tops and also sigh and sob. In the deep night, we are again holding candles, facing each other as in a dream. I think that ending is really amazing when Du Fu is coming back to being reunited with his family, and when it's finally happening, he can't believe it's actually happening. He sort of pulls the ground out from under it by saying it's a dream or resembles a dream. And in that same period of civil strife, Wang Wei, who's a Chan Zen Buddhist, meets someone and he wants to know about the village that he came from. And by contrast, here's a very different kind of response to the Civil War period. And deliberately, Wang Wei chooses to have no title, so it's untitled. Sir, you come from my native home and should know the affairs there. The day you left, beside the silk-paned window, did the cold plum sprout flowers or not? One more poem about China, and then I'm going to move on to other subjects. But a few years ago, I was at an international poetry festival at Huangshan in Yellow Mountain. And every morning, I would just write down a few phrases. And then this poem sort of came together when I came back to New Mexico. There's one Chinese word, a shun, which is a musical instrument. It's a kind of ceramic, clay, and they're different sizes, but they have holes in them. So you blow into one hole, and then you cover and uncover the other holes to make music. It's a very haunting sound. This is called Pig's Heaven Inn. Red chilies in a tilted basket catch sunlight. We walk past a pile of burning mulberry leaves into Shidi village. Enter a courtyard. Notice an inkstone engraved with calligraphy filled with water and cassia petals. Smell Ming Dynasty redwood panels. As a musician lifts a small shun to his mouth and blows, I see kiwis hanging from branches above a moon doorway. A grandmother, once the youngest concubine, propped in a chair with bandages around her knees, complains of incessant pain. Someone spits in the street. As a second musician plucks strings on a zither, pomelos blacken on branches. A woman peels chestnuts. Two men in a flat-bottomed boat gather duckweed out of a river. The notes splash silvery onto cobblestone, and my fingers suddenly ache. During the Cultural Revolution, my aunt's husband leapt out of a third-story window. At dawn, I mistook the cries of birds for rain. When the musicians pause, yellow mountain pines sway near Bright Summit Peak. A pig scuffles behind an enclosure. Someone blows his nose. Traces of the past are wisps of mulberry smoke rising above roof tiles. And before we too vanish, we hike to where three trails converge. Hundreds of people are stopped ahead of us. Hundreds come up behind. We form a rivulet of people funneling down through a chasm in the granite. I think maybe one short poem and then one last longer piece. I like reading across books, and this poem I'm going to read next created my own kind of stricture or requirement. And I like poems that balance a kind of spontaneity and a kind of rigor. And you can have a formal rigor like a sonnet or a villanelle where certain requirements are predetermined. And in this particular poem, I was just playing with language, kind of like jazz, and I had certain repetitions. And as I noticed that, I thought, well, what would happen if I wrote a poem where each line or each line had to pick up a word or words from the previous line? It's called Comet Hyakutake. Comet Hyakutake's tail stretches for 360 million miles. In 1996, we saw Hyakutake through binoculars. The ion tail contains the time we saw bats emerge out of a cavern at dusk. In the cavern, we first heard stalactites dripping. First silence, then reverberating sound. Our touch reverberates and makes a blossoming track. A comet's nucleus emits X-rays and leaves tracks. 2,000 miles away you box up books, and in 2 days will step through the invisible rays of an airport scanner. We write on invisible pages in an invisible book with invisible ink. In nature's book, we read a few pages. In the sky, we read the ion tracks from the orchard, the apple orchard where blossoms unfold, where we unfold. Budding, the child who writes the puzzle comes to life. Elated, puzzled, shocked, dismayed, confident, loving. Minutes to an hour. A minute, a pinhole lens through which light passes. Comet Hyakutake will not pass Earth for another 100,000 years. No matter, ardor is here. And to the writer of fragments, each fragment is a whole. I'm going to read one last poem and then open it up for some discussion. I gave myself the challenge of writing a longer piece that had no section dividers, and the poem is called Chrysalis, which is that intermediate stage before the butterfly appears. And I think of it as a kind of eco-poetic poem too, a meshing of contemporary poetry and ecology with our endangered world and challenged world. Chrysalis. Corpses push up through thawing permafrost as I scrape salmon skin off a pan at the sink. On the porch, motes in slanting yellow light undulate in air. Is Venus at dusk as luminous as Venus at dawn? Yesterday, I was about to seal a borax capsule angled up from the bottom of a decaying exterior jam when I glimpsed jagged ice floating in a bay. Naval sonar slices through whales even as a portion of male dorsal fin is served to the captain of an umiak. Stopped in traffic, He swings from a chairlift, gazes down at scarlet paintbrush. Moistening an envelope before sealing it, I recall the slight noise you made when I grazed your shoulder, when a frost wiped out the chalk blue flowering plant by the door. I watered until it revived from the roots. The song of a knife sharpener in an alley passes through the mind of a microbiologist before he undergoes anesthesia for surgery. The first night of autumn has singed bell peppers by the fence, while budding chamisa stalks in the courtyard bend to ground. Observing people conversing at a nearby table, he visualizes the momentary convergence and divergence of lines passing through a point. The wisteria along the porch never blooms. A praying mantis on the wood floor sips water from a dog bowl. Laughter from upstairs echoes downstairs as teenage girls compare bra sizes. An ex-Army officer turned critic frets over the composition of a search committee, snickers and disparages rival candidates. A welder who turns away for a few seconds to gaze at the Sangre de Cristos detects a line of trucks backed up on an international overpass where exhaust spews onto houses below. The day may be called One Tooth Road or Six Thunder Pane, but the naming of a day will not transform it, nor will the mathematics of time halt. An imprint of ginkgo leaf, fan-shaped, slightly thickened, slightly wavy on broad edge, two-lobed, with forking parallel veins but no mid-vein, in a slab of coal, is momentary beauty. While ginkgos along a street dropping gold leaves are mindless beauty of the quotidian. Once thought extinct, the ginkgo is discovered in Himalayan monasteries and propagated back into the world. Although I cannot save a grasshopper singed by frost, trying to warm itself on a sunlit walkway, I ponder shadows of budding pink and orange bougainvilleas on a wall. As masons level sand, lay bricks in horizontal then vertical pairs, we construct the ground to render a space or own. As light from a partial lunar eclipse diffuses down skylight walls, we rock and sluice, fingertips fan to fan fingertips, debouche into plentitude. Venus vanishes in a brightening sky. The diamond ring of a solar eclipse persists. You did not have to fly to Zimbabwe in June 2001 to experience it. The day recalls 13 death and 1 deer when an end slips into a beginning. I recall mating butterflies with red dots on wings, the bow of a longliner thudding on waves, crescendo of water beginning to boil in a kettle, echoes of humpback whales. In silence, dancers concentrate on movements on stage, lilacs bud by a gate. As bits of consciousness constellate, I rouse to a 3 a.m. December rain on the skylight. A woman sweeps glass shards in a driveway, oblivious to elm branches reflected on windshields of passing cars. Juniper crackles in the fireplace. Flukes break the water as a whale dives. The path of totality is not marked by a shadow hurtling across the Earth's surface at 3,000 kilometers per hour, or eyelashes attuned to each other. At the mouth of an arroyo, a lamb skull and rib cage bleach in the sand. Tufts of fleece caught on barbed wire vanish. The Zhang carved characters in the skulls of their enemies, but what transpired here? You did not need to steep turtle shells in blood to prognosticate clouds. Someone dumps a refrigerator upstream in the riverbed while you admire the yellow blossoms of a golden rain tree. A woman weeds, sniffs fragrance from a line of onions in her garden. You scramble an egg, sip oolong tea. The continuous bifurcates into the segmented as the broken extends. Someone steals a newspaper while we doze. A tiger swallowtail lands on a patio columbine. A single agaric breaks soil by a hollyhock. Pushing aside branches of Russian olives to approach the Powaki River, we spot a splatter of flicker feathers in the dirt. Here chance and fate enmesh. Here I hold a black bowl rinsed with tea, savor the warmth at my fingertips, aroma of emptiness. We rock back and forth on water. Fins of spinner dolphins break the waves. A whale spouts to the north-northwest. What is not impelled? Yellow hibiscus, zodiac, hairbrush, barbed wire, smog, snowflake. When I still my eyes, the moments dilate. Rain darkens gravel in the courtyard. Shriveled apples on branches are weightless against dawn. Thank you. We have some time for some discussion. Are there questions? Comments?
I'm struck by the rich fusion of sensibilities and experience, science, Chinese poetry, Western poetry. And I was curious, I was thinking back to your account of sitting in the classroom at MIT scribbling poetry, and I couldn't help but wonder, at what point were you introduced to Chinese poetry as a young child or later? Because some of your poems sound very Chinese and others very, very American in many ways.
I was born in New York City, and so yeah, I am American in the contemporary, the speech, the voice is completely American, I think. I could understand a lot of Mandarin Chinese as a child, and occasionally I would go to Chinese language school on Sundays as a kid. But it wasn't until I was consciously writing poetry, and when I transferred to the University of California at Berkeley, I thought, I want to read some of the Chinese poems, and my Chinese wasn't that good, so I turned to English translations of them, thinking that I could learn from that tradition. And what I quickly discovered was, or felt, was that the translations in English actually were opaque. They actually blocked access to the Chinese. There's a great phrase in Italian, tradutori traditori, which is translators, traitors, which I've never forgotten. And so a lot of the translations I read of ancient Chinese poetry felt very stiff to me. Even Arthur Waley, who was lionized as the great translator when I was a student at Berkeley, when I read his translations in English, the diction felt Victorian, the whole manner felt very alien, foreign. And I thought, I really need to learn the Chinese to be able to read it in the original, and maybe one thing I can do is as I translate them, I can honor some of those ancient poems, but I can also learn my craft. So it wasn't until I was a student at Berkeley that I actually read Chinese poetry for the first time, and I read them character by character. I was very driven and motivated, so a lot of what happened outside of the classroom. There was a teaching assistant from Taiwan, Tsai Mei-shi, who taught conversational Mandarin. And one day I went up to him after the language session and I said, I'm working on this Tang Dynasty poetry, trying to translate it, and I'm having difficulty with the structure of classical Chinese. And he was like, oh, I love these poems. I'll help you with them. And so it became this thing where I would meet with Tsai about every 3 or 4 weeks at the Oriental Languages Library at Berkeley. And we would sit down and I would go through the Tang poems and he would look at my drafts and he would say, well, your reading of this character is wrong. And what I liked to do then was for each Chinese character, write clusters of words in English, rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to translate. I really took my time and I thought, well, each Chinese character is so rich, I'll create a field of energy and I'll write 3 or 4 words in English that help demarcate that field of energy for that Chinese character. So I would have these crib sheets where they were just like words scattered all over the page, but they helped me sort of zoom in on what I thought was happening. And then I eventually worked them into lines in English. So it was a long, laborious process, but it wasn't until I was at Berkeley and this graduate student really trained me in reading classical Chinese, and it was never a part of a class. And I did that for 2 years with him. About once a month I would sit down and we would go through Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, a lot of the great poems, and he would sometimes see a reference he didn't know, and he'd go rummage in the Oriental Languages Library, and he'd pull out some Chinese text, and he'd say, oh, well, this refers to this. And so I got this whole training that was sort of in between the classes. So maybe a final comment is, although I'm obviously drawing on a lot of Chinese tradition and have a good knowledge of it, I don't want to be limited or bound by that. I was talking in the poetry class today about breaking apart the well-made vessel. I want to take that Chinese tradition and be able to break it apart and reassemble it, because our world today is so different, and certainly my voice is contemporary. So I like to think of it as a stream or source of inspiration, but that I'm not bound by it. Please, go ahead. You have.
This is sort of related to that. I was struck by the unexpected juxtaposition of images which occur frequently and beautifully. I gather they were unexpected to you also, but I wondered if you would comment on that.
On how those poems happen?
How those juxtapositions of the unexpected happen.
I think for me it's a process of discovery, but it's also one of my obsessions. I forget which class today, writing out some Chinese characters and saying, well, look at how Chinese language is structured. If you have a plant and you juxtapose fire, you have the character autumn. So you have an image there of tree tip or plant tips on fire. But then if you take autumn and you juxtapose it to heart and mind, then you actually have a Chinese character that accomplishes metaphor inside of that character. So sorrow is autumn in the heart and mind. So looking at Chinese characters, I'm sort of endlessly fascinated by, well, how did this combination get picked? Even something as simple as why is sun and moon juxtaposed make the word bright? It could have made the word eclipse or something about moonshine or sunshine. So it seems really mysterious but endlessly fascinating to me. And I like to think my poetic process is often obsessed with the relationship between part and whole. sort of having lots of fragments and not being quite sure where they go, or playing with how they might be moved around next to each other. And to invoke science, I like to think of it as kind of like magnetic energy. They can attract or repel, and that repellent energy isn't necessarily bad. It creates a lot of tension inside of the language or line. So I'm constantly trying to experiment with how things connect or don't connect with each other. I think in my writing process, I often might have an idea to start with, and then I shed it. It's like I discover other things that I wouldn't have foreseen that come out, and so I kind of make a big mess, and it's sort of sprawling. But eventually, I feel like I've got to have some kind of rigor or underlying structure, and then as that poem starts to shrink down, I find myself sifting and thinking, well, what if it's intuitive? You know, what if this happens and then this happens, or vice versa? And I've just worked very hard at that, I think. I like to have a kind of loose narrative thread, but maybe I've sometimes got several stories or narratives being spun together, or sometimes I want to stop the motion of the narrative line and have a lot of fragments, or create different tonalities or textures. So it's something I am working very hard at, but it's not premeditated. I have to kind of make a mess of things and then instinctively feel like what's essential, what's most interesting. And that process is very slow. How about some more? These are great comments.
Should I stand up? I really thank you for you come to have this point with us. While you read the point, this is when you read English, I understand, but my mind traces back to the Chinese original point. This is three great Chinese poem. It's Li Bai, Du Pu, Tao Yanmin. We study from them when we was in the school, from the elementary school till high school. And when you read that, it's make me think this is poetry say, every time you read that and you want to want to invite a friend to drink wine. That's when I'm from Taiwan. Every time I read this, I feel wanted to drink wine and ask a friend, because we are immigrant person, always have some kind of lonesome side in here. And 3 decades, I kept all those books. When every time I have a special depressed or don't feel right, I will go read those books. So I feel kind of you really come to share with me, and that's what I will share with you. What I feel.
Thank you. I think, when you look at the lives of those ancient poets, they're often traveling upstream or downstream, or they're meeting someone, and then it's got that sense of transience is very present. And the Tao Chen poems, he's alone, he's isolated, and there's a kind of solitude, and yet there's also a kind of reaching out and communion. So I think that's one of the powers of those ancient poems, is they are somehow reaching out in beautiful and mysterious ways. Sure. How is my last name pronounced? In Mandarin, it's actually Shi. It has Fang on the left. It means donation, to give. Yeah, and in Shanghai dialect it's Si. But my grandfather was in Shanghai, and he was the one who first came to America, and he was thinking about how to use Western letters, and he came up with SCE. But, in the pinyin system today in China, you would spell it SHI, be sure. And so then my family's been arguing over, well, how do you say this character? Should we change the spelling of the last name? And people don't want to do that. And then it's well, nobody uses the Shanghai pronunciation. So it's become Americanized to Z. Thank you. I guess we'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, we want to thank you, and it's been a great night. So thank you so much for
Oh.
coming. Let's give him a hand. Okay?
Thank you so much.